Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Anticipatory briefing number 4. Welcome to our live audience. Welcome to people watching us online, wherever you are in the world. My name is Laurent Haug. I'm going to host this session. Today we have with us from Brazil, currently living in Portugal, the founder and president of the Faneros Institute. I said it well. It took me like 10 tries. It's a Brazilian nonprofit pioneering clinical research on psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy and training for health professionals. The Institute has over 800 students. His work focuses on psychoactive drugs and their varied effects, both harmful and therapeutic, with a focus on psychedelic substance. He's going to tell us about psychedelic medicine. Please help me welcome Eduardo Schenberg.
Bonjour, bon dia, good morning. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks the GESDA team for the invitation and all of you for choosing this room and to be here with me to discuss this topic. Which is a very interesting topic in many aspects, culturally, historically, politically. And as we were discussing yesterday during dinner, it's also interesting because perhaps it's a potential solution for a big problem that's coming from an area that many people don't think any solution could come from, which is illegal drugs, right? How could illegal drugs that were made illegal because they are deemed to be dangerous become suddenly a mental health solution or mental health treatment, right? And I find this is a very interesting aspect for us to discuss. So before I dive into this interesting request or challenge that GESDA made for me to talk about psychedelics in the next 5, 10, and more down in the next 25 years, I'd like to talk a bit of me and psychedelics in the last 25 years. And not because I indulge in talking about myself, but because I want you to know who's up here speaking and what are my perspectives in this topic, right? So about 25 years ago, I had an unusual experience going to a church in my home country, Brazil. It's not a common church. It was formed out of the colonization of the Amazon, right? So we have this mixture of indigenous plant rituals with Christianity, with some African spirituality, and military social hierarchy. It's a very unique cultural phenomena. And it's pretty much, today, it's pretty much all around Brazil and also internationally in many, many countries. In most of the cases, operating legally under specific authorizations for religious use of a psychedelic compound, right? Which is commonly known as ayahuasca. It's a word that comes from the Quechua indigenous language in Latin America. And ayahuasca contains a very powerful chemical substance. It's not just this one, but this is the main compound. It's N,N-dimethyltryptamine, or DMT. And DMT has a very powerful capacity to make humans see things with the eyes closed. I know it may seem kind of outlandish and strange and maybe weird, but it really does. And it has been assessed using neuroimaging by colleagues of mine in Brazil. And they've shown that the activity in the visual cortex during ayahuasca with eyes closed resemble the brain pattern when we have our eyes open. And people report seeing many, many different things, a variety of things. Even perhaps colors that don't exist outside of this, let's say, awakened dream, right? And I have this very, very meaningful experience in this church, right? And this triggered my interest in this field at a time when it was not really being so many studies as we're seeing today. Also important to note, there's another psychedelic compound, very, very similar to DMT, which is called psilocybin, and it comes from sacred indigenous mushrooms used in Mexico and other species of mushrooms as well, right? And one of my favorite pieces of data in the entire psychedelic scientific literature comes from Johns Hopkins University in the US. They're running studies for more than 20 years, non-stop, and they made like hundreds to thousands of sessions with healthy volunteers and patients in the university. And about 70% or 2/3 of these people, they rate their psilocybin experience in the university as one of the 5 most meaningful experiences of their entire lives. Then like, how is this possible, right? Who goes as a volunteer to a scientific study in a university and rates the experience as similar to the day you have a child or when your mother passes away and things like that, or the day you get married, right? So psychedelics really do have something that they trigger in human beings, which seem to be quite unique and very powerful. So about 10 years ago, we were publishing 2 very important papers on the neuroimaging of ayahuasca and LSD. The ayahuasca study was done in Brazil. The LSD study was done at Imperial College in London. These 2 papers, about almost 10 years later, together, they are counting almost 1,000 scientific citations. So this tells us how much interest there is, an increasing interest inside academic studies and universities on this topic. And about 5 years ago, I was pioneering the first clinical study with a psychedelic and a model that we call psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy or psychedelic-assisted therapy in Brazil. And this was published in the Brazilian Journal of Psychiatry, and I got an award, and I was honored by a Brazilian magazine for doing this work to treat patients with post-traumatic stress disorder. It's a serious psychiatric condition, and patients with PTSD, they have a very high rate of suicide attempts and completed suicides, and it's kind of social, very, very problematic social situation. So this is an important possibility for new treatments. And this is where we are now. This is the overview of the psychedelic literature from 1946 up to 2023. It's almost 32,000 studies, and you can see there where we were 25 years ago, 10 years ago, and 5 years ago, and where we are now. And this number is likely to keep increasing because big players in the field, such as the NIH in the US, who didn't fund any psychedelic study for many decades, now they are back funding studies. And the FDA and the EMA here in Europe, they are publishing guidelines on the best practices for psychedelic clinical trials. So there's a lot of literature, and how about quality? This is a quick way to address that question. These are 8 scientific journal covers dedicated to psychedelic medicine and psychedelic research. Journals like Cell, where we saw a crystallography study showing the nano details of how the LSD molecule binds to a protein that exists in our neurons, in our brains, up to psychopharmacology and mostly in psychiatry, right? So this is about 1 journal cover every year, right? So this topic is really becoming very, very important. Also, during the pandemic, pretty much in the last about 3 years, it became a biotech industry. So nowadays, we have literally hundreds of startups and half a dozen public companies running studies and putting money in some of these compounds to develop those through clinical trials and bring them to market. And DataBridge is forecasting that this will be soon a market of about $6 to $7 billion. So here's my first prediction, and this one I'm quite confident about, although of course we cannot be sure. But in the next 5 years, we're very likely to see FDA and probably EMA as well approving first MDMA and then psilocybin. MDMA is being studied mostly for post-traumatic stress disorder, and psilocybin for major depression or treatment-resistant depression, right? MDMA already completed 2 phase 3 trials published at Nature Medicine, and psilocybin completed a series of phase 2 trials, and 2 phase 3 trials are starting as we have this session here. So what's important to understand here is that these will not be just new drugs for the psychiatric mental health sector. These are not drugs that psychiatrists should prescribe and the patient take at home as they do with current antidepressant or SSRIs, the serotonin, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, right? These drugs, they change the state of consciousness. Their action, acute action, can last 6 to 10 hours, depending on the dose, on the patient, the condition, and the emotional reaction that each one has. There's a very huge need for education to train therapists on how to do these procedures, and also to train the patient population about what to expect out of these treatments. In the next 10 years, I would predict that we will see the same happening to a series of other compounds. So we have mescaline, which comes from cacti, used since prehistory. There's archaeological evidence of the use of peyote for more than 5,000 years. This is older than the origin of writing. We also have LSD, the famous Swiss invention, created near here in Basel by Albert Hofmann in Sandoz Company. We have 5-MeO-DMT, a very strange compound found in a toad. And no one knows how someone discovered that a toad has a poison that contains a chemical that can have such strange and interesting properties. Ibogaine comes from an African root used spiritually in Gabon and Cameroon in West Africa, and ayahuasca that we already discussed. So for the next decade, there are a series of new compounds coming into the mental health sector that require lots of anticipation and work for us to be prepared to use these treatments wisely, safely, and ethically. Right? There are many considerations that are important to do because these are not to be take-at-home drugs. This is very, very important. It's simple, but if we miss this point, we can create lots of iatrogenic harm. So 25 years from now, it's kind of very difficult for me to make a bet on how will the psychedelic field be. I thought many hours about that, and I said, I'll probably get it wrong. It will be interesting 25 years from now to revisit the video of this session, and let's see what I was thinking back then. I think I will be retiring by then, hopefully, healthy, but getting old. And then I figured out, I think the best prediction is already out there. And it has been given to us by the experts. I was here yesterday listening to the climate experts talking about the health of the planet. And Johan Rockström, he said, we are in a very bad situation. The Earth has multiple organ failure. So that's a very alarming diagnosis. But he was optimistic on the prognosis. We can do a lot. We have the solutions available. And we need to do it in this decade. It is to us, the adult generation, now and in the next 5 to 10 years, that we need to change lots of things. And what's the connection here between chemicals and brains and the planetary situation that most often I think is missed? Is indigenous rights. The IPCC is very clear that to reach the goals of the Paris Agreement and to mitigate climate change, indigenous territories, indigenous rights and sovereignty, and the protection of indigenous cultures is essential. And almost all, if not all, psychedelic compounds originate from the knowledge and traditions of indigenous people. So there's a huge potential here to connect this growing biotech industry, not only to develop mental health treatments, but to prevent mental health problems due to climate change. climate change is for sure, I'm very convinced of this, it's for sure the biggest mental health threat we have. If we run for 2.6 or more degrees Celsius of warming, the situation will be very difficult, and perhaps even with the most scalable and best treatments that science can develop, it might not be enough to keep us united and in good international relationships as a human society in this planet. So think about the possibilities here. The Canada government pledged $100 million per year to protect indigenous rights. The Rockefeller Foundation is committing a similar amount. Biden, the president of the US, he pledged $500 million. That's less than 10% of the projected economic value of the psychedelic biotech industry. And we have international treaties in place. We have the Convention for Biological Diversity, we have the Nagoya Protocol, we have human rights, and we have the rights to enjoy the benefits of scientific progress and its application in the UN. So we need to work to make this legally binding and to assure that this industry contributes to protecting the rights of those who originated the knowledge which is now becoming this powerful and very important biotech industry. So here I'm listing a series of very important work that need to be done in a series of areas, and I'm happy to be connected with groups of international researchers, lawyers, and bioethicists from many fields, so that we can develop this properly. And I think it's excellent that we're having this conversation here at the GESDA Summit, because really it's a field that we need to anticipate ourselves, and we need to prepare our healthcare sectors in order to really use these wisely. So we need to discuss ethics, research, education of the mental health professionals. We need to discuss international law related to controlled compounds and also indigenous rights, benefit sharing, open science, IP, scalability and accessibility, human rights, and social justice. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you, Eduardo.
Yes, okay. I brought some water for you. But...
Thank you very much. So many questions I have to ask you, and then we're going to go to the audience questions. Please use the app that the link was at the beginning of the session. Send us your question, and I will relay them to Eduardo. One thing that really blew my mind, I mean, you probably know that, but I stumbled on this book called Chasing the Scream, which tells the history of the war on drugs, so-called war on drugs. And can you walk us through the history of the relationship between society and drugs? Because to my amazement, the first Coke recipe had cocaine.
Yep.
The Queen Victoria was smoking opium cigarettes openly. The soldiers in the trenches of the First World War were getting a mix of wine and cocaine. I mean, drugs were embedded into society and completely accepted, with the pluses and the downsides, obviously.
Yes.
And then there was this kind of crazy war on drugs starting in the US, and that spread all over. We get to this point where you would be jailed for having 1 gram of whatever. And now it's opening up again. And I think a lot of people do not know that story, that we're actually going back to where we were a century ago. Can you quickly walk us, history quickly, but can you tell us a bit about that?
It's a long story, and it's an important story. We also had sessions here about war and peace, and I felt the absence of discussions about the drug war. It's a serious problem. It creates lots of damages in Latin America and Asia, which are mostly the production zones of the drugs that come to North America and Europe for the consumer markets, right? But usually when we talk about the drug war, we think about what started in the 60s and 70s, but it's much older than that. In about 2 weeks, I'm flying to the US, and I'll participate in a conference in the University of Wisconsin in Madison, and we're gonna have indigenous leaders there, and we're gonna have a discussion about documents about the prohibition of peyote in the 17th century. So pretty much what we're seeing is that so-called Western industrialized society try to ban drugs and to ban altered or modified or non-ordinary states of consciousness. But actually what we're now learning through science is that some of these non-ordinary states of consciousness, they're not pathological and they're not dangerous, and they can carry healing potential and transformative potential in a positive way for individuals, families, and communities. So historically, there is this sense of something that was lost and actually demonized. Many stories about demons and witches were connected with indigenous rituals, employing these substances and compounds in ritualistic ways. So there is a kind of a sense of a reawakening or a recovering of some ancestry that was lost.
Yeah, if you look at that book, Chasing the Scream, it tells the story of how like someone used that problem of drugs to basically expand their power inside the administration. Maybe you know that rule, institution will try to preserve the problem to which they are the solution. So they actually made a problem out of something that was not, to expand their power. Very interesting story. One thing also that I'd like you to expand while the questions are going to come in. What is the actual function of something like ayahuasca? Because I think there's one of the authorities on topic lives in Lausanne, and I had a discussion with him one day, and he told me that he actually had that process of using that with the shaman had a function in the life of the group and in the life of an individual. So can you tell us a bit about that?
I think the way to address this question is to understand that drugs don't have effects that we can separate from the context and social environments of their use, right? So it's one thing to drink whiskey after a funeral, and it's another thing to drink whiskey in a marriage, right? And for ayahuasca, it's kind of the same. Ayahuasca actually, in Brazil, we're starting to talk about ayahuascas in the plural, because ayahuasca in the singular almost doesn't exist. There are hundreds of different preparations of ayahuasca with chemical differences, and there are perhaps dozens of different types of use. So if you're using ayahuasca with an indigenous shaman, which is not an indigenous concept, by the way, it's a Western notion, or if you're using ayahuasca in a church, right? Or if you're using ayahuasca inside a brain imaging device in an fMRI scanner, your experiences are going to be different. They change the oscillatory patterns of the cortex, and they change how we perceived all the sensory information that's coming from the environment and from our bodies, right? So you feel everything differently. And if you're in a scanner or if you're in a church, of course, you're going to have different experiences, and this needs to be taken into consideration.
But I think it was some kind of reboot. That's how it was presented to me. It's a kind of space where you can kind of get rid of a lot of things that bothers you, and then kind of allow you to live better. So that was the function of like, use this to kind of live better through some kind of exit mechanism, or?
I think that's the pursuit. The goal of this research, or one of the main goals, should be how to optimize the experiences for them to be the result in the most desirable and positive goals, like giving up drug addiction. There are a series of studies of psychedelics for drug addiction, opioid, alcohol addiction, tobacco addiction, cocaine addiction, and people can quit like 20 years of drug addiction in 2 or 3 psychedelic experiences. Like, that's really something that needs to be looked at, right?
Exactly. And so the moment we've been living, so we went through this like forbidding the drugs, and now it's been opening up again. So the US, countries like the Netherlands, obviously, more and more US states are legalizing marijuana. And now it starts to be mushrooms. So, something that was unthinkable, like Oregon, Australia, are opening up to that. Can you tell us a bit what's happening around this particular thing, which is in the news right now?
Yeah, it was very interesting for me to be invited to talk about the future of psychedelics, because I thought, well, 10 years ago, if they asked me, I wouldn't guess correctly that we would be in a biotech booming sector of psychedelics right now. We thought this would take 50 years. It took 10, right? So it's difficult to anticipate, But what we see in the political and social environment, I think that what's making the train move is cannabis. So the politics around cannabis has been changing a lot in many countries, right, including the US. And after cannabis, as the population gets to change their minds really about it and understand it from new perspectives, then it opens up space for talking about other substances as well.
In Portugal, actually, has a very interesting legal framework.
Portugal has decriminalized all drugs 23 years ago, and they're going well with this policy.
In Switzerland, we had politicians in Geneva actually fighting for that. Ruud Dreyfus, who did a lot for looking at addiction in a different way. So I'm going to go to the audience questions. Question number one, do you see a future, that's probably somebody working for like an advertising agency or something. Do you see a future in using psychedelics to find creative solutions and opening up new perspectives related to climate change also?
I do. I think that another interesting field is the study of psychedelics and creativity. And my favorite example of that, it's not the only one, but it's my favorite, was Kerry Mullis, a molecular biologist who also happened to be a surfer. He loved to surf. And he was awarded the Nobel Prize in Medicine for inventing the PCR, which is the main piece of technology of the whole genomic revolution. And the PCR is related to COVID vaccines, for example. And he was open, you can find it on YouTube, he admitting that the use of LSD inspired him to better understand the molecular world and how things operate. And he said that it's not that LSD gave him the solution to do PCR, but the creativity that it opened up, without that, maybe he would never have succeeded in creating the gene cloning technique. So there is actual very important evidence connecting psychedelic experiences to creativity in science and also more famously in art. I think this is the part that everybody thinks about when they hear the word psychedelic.
That's pretty cool. So if I take a Swiss-German accountant and I give them LSD, I get Pablo Picasso. That's pretty cool. If psychedelic therapies get accepted, do you think there is a future use in developing creativity-inducing drugs? It's kind of a related question. Like, could we specifically target creativity, and could we have like a magic creativity pill?
Maybe we can. There's another field. It's kind of a spin-off of the psychedelic biotech industry, which is being called the psychoplastogens. So there are hundreds of new compounds. What medicinal chemists are doing right now is like you can get the LSD molecule and you can think, well, this is how it binds in this receptor. So what about if I change 2 or 3 atoms here and create a similar compound, or substitute one atom for another one and put another group? And they can do literally hundreds to thousands of compounds. And they're putting AI to try to see in the computer what we can do. So we can get now compounds that don't really get the psychedelic experience, the hallucinations, the changes in consciousness, but they trigger neuroplasticity. They stimulate neurons to do new synaptic connections, which is something that the classic psychedelics also tend to do, right? So if we want to look straight at creativity, I think there are potentials there, but this is something for, I don't know, I would say 50 years from now.
Do we want that, though?
That's a very important question.
Okay, what kind of meeting do we have today? Brainstorm. Okay, everybody take the blue pill. Let's be creative, guys. I can see how that could be a corporate nightmare.
There's one important concept.
Too many ideas.
Yeah, there's one important concept, which is not everything that we can do, we should do. And this is very important for research and ethics.
Yes, I think in general, it's a very important idea. Question number 3, how come the increasing understanding of hallucinogenic molecules bindings combined with simulation technology, so I think here we're talking about the protein manufacturing using AI or simulation, hasn't led yet to new synthetically designed hallucinogenic drugs similar to LSD?
It has. As I was mentioning, there are hundreds of compounds out there. But
okay, can you give us the names, please?
When we look to the clinical development pipeline, right, to take a drug to market, it takes around a decade, if not more. It really depends on where you start. So if you're starting from new chemicals that you're designing in the computer, which is something really, really recent, and we don't know the risks of these compounds, and you gotta test in vitro, and you gotta test in mice, and in monkeys, and so on, it will take a long, long time. But there are so many possibilities out there if we think about combining the neuroscience with artificial intelligence, with medicinal chemistry and psychiatry. This can become something really, really important.
There are technologies to actually kind of print, 3D print drugs. Like you can kind of design a protein and...
Maybe.
I think there's AutoCAD is working on that, so that Wired event. Is there a difference between the effects of natural and quote-unquote chemical psychedelics? Is there such a thing as a bio psychedelic and a non-bio, organic and non-organic?
Yeah, I think there's a tendency in the general population, especially, I get this asked a lot, as if what's organic is healthy because it's organic, it's from nature, it's beautiful, and the synthetics would be dangerous and polluting, right? There is a sense to that, but also there are lots of poisons in nature, right? 5-MeO-DMT, for example, that comes from the toad I mentioned, the toad is producing a defensive toxin, really, to leave us away. But if we can isolate this compound and use it in precise quantities, we can have beneficial effects. There are other examples of things that are brought from poisons and can have medicinal applications. So this tells us that the distinction, especially the lay distinction between artificial or synthetic equals dangerous and natural equals healthy, it's complicated and people should be aware that it's not the best distinction.
So speaking of the toads, are there theories as to how it was discovered?
There are, I think the most probable one is that some crazy guy leaked the toad, but we don't really know. We have all kinds of stories.
But if he was crazy before leaking the toad, how do we know it?
Yeah, that's a difficult one to ask.
We have to catch a toad, barbecue it, and see what happens. Question number 5. Today, around 1 out of 5 young people in the world suffers from a mental health condition. How could psychedelic health help those two, given the ethical considerations, limitations we know to administer drugs to that demographic?
Yeah, I think that's a very important question. Thanks for asking it. One of the big challenges of the field right now is the issue of accessibility and scalability, right? So the biotech industry is very used to the pharmaceutical model, where you develop a drug and you pack this drug in 20 pills blisters and you ship it worldwide and people get it at the drugstore and they make literally huge profits. The pharmaceutical industry is one of the most profitable industries in the planet. Some estimates say that the FDA in the US regulates almost 50% of the US economy. So drugs are very profitable. But as I was saying before, I think that putting psychedelics in this way in the healthcare marketplace will create lots of iatrogenic harm. So it's very important to understand this model called psychedelic assisted therapy. These are like 7 to 8 hour long sessions, usually guided by 2 therapists. And patients listen to music and they do therapy before, during, and after the effects of psychedelics. Most protocols include 1, 2, or 3 psychedelic sessions in a period of a few months with lots of supervision. This brings safety, this is bringing efficacy in the clinical trials, but this raises issues for scalability. And some of the for-profit companies trying to develop these compounds, they are arguing that the therapy component is not necessary and should be reduced. And I'm part of some researchers who are making calls that these are hard to accept because of the risks and probably are influenced by conflicts of interest. So there is an issue here of the scalability and accessibility on the one hand and the safety and efficacy in the other hand.
Actually, I was reading an article about the fight in the harbors, like Anvers, against illegal drugs. I think it was The Economist, which arguing that actually the biggest industry in the world is illegal drugs by like a factor of 2 compared to oil, which is second. So it tells you it's a huge opportunity for governments to kind of, you know, control that and legalize it and tax it, obviously. Very interesting question. How is your view on microdosing, i.e., augmenting humans with drugs on a 24/7 basis?
So microdosing is a more recent trend, which started in California, and it's called microdosing because LSD is so potent that it's actually active in the micrograms range, like 10 to 100 micrograms. You don't get that from most other drugs are active in the range of milligrams. That's 1,000 times more or 100 times more, right? And people started using LSD in such small quantities that they don't get the psychedelic experience. And at first, microdosing was, it should be so low that you don't feel anything. And you can work, you can drive. And people would say they got better creativity, memory, better mood, better libido, better lots of things, which raises suspicion, right? This is the trend when we see hype in healthcare products, right? And then scientists started studying microdose, and one study after the other, they are most not confirming these advantages of using these substances. And also microdose, they use it every day or every other day or something like that. And now there are calls for concern because some of these compounds, they can also be active in some cardiac receptors. And if used chronically, people could develop cardiac issues. So, and this is very different from psychedelic therapy, where people would use the compounds very few times in their lifetimes, and then it's the cardiologic risk is very low. So my opinion is that microdosing, it's more hype than science, and it's not the way that psychedelics will be more beneficial.
We speak of microdose, but clearly we have some American presidents who are hooked on macro doses. Do you find it problematic that the ritual aspect of psychedelics is subject to erosion, you know, like shrooms and LSD becoming the next big thing, becoming trendy among younger people, for example, at music festivals?
They are already trendy for a long time. As you said, the illicit drug market is huge, and we also have some epidemiological data with like hundreds of thousands of respondents of the national surveys in the US, for example, who use psychedelics, and researchers were able to show, for example, that people who use psychedelics and were involved in crime, they had less recidivism. They went back to crime less often. And psychedelics were the only compounds with this negative association. The use of alcohol or cocaine were associated with more recidivism in crime, right? So these are very interesting compounds, and they can be used in a lot of different ways. And I think there's a tendency currently for like people who use or study their ritual use to say, no, this is the only way, and it's wrong to do anything else. You should do this way. Or people who don't like religion or who don't like indigenous culture to say, no, this is not the proper way. The proper way we're going to develop here through science. And actually we should be more open for diversity, right? And that different societies and different people in different situations, they can use the same or similar substances with different goals.
Do we know anything about the relationship between the therapeutic efficacity, whatever, of psychedelics and the person's history of drug use? For example, if you have a history of using MDMA regularly, does this reduce the therapeutic effects?
Well, what we know so far is first that psychedelics are not highly addictive. So this is really clearly established, and there's lots of reasons for that, right? And they're even being used to treat addiction. But when people use psychedelics repeatedly in short intervals, like they go to a music festival and they take LSD 3-4 times in a week, the effect decreases a lot. And we can see in vitro studies that what happens is that when you have the presence of the drug too often, the neurons, they remove the receptors from the membrane. They internalize the receptors and reprocess that protein because there is too much signal coming in. And the neuron is all the time changing itself based on the stimuli it's receiving, right? And this helps explain why if people repeat the use too much, the effect tends to decrease. However, if people give an interval of about 2 to 3 weeks, and then they take again, and then they get the effect again. And it's very interesting to note that the ayahuasca churches in Brazil, they mostly run on a 2-week running period. So they have rituals or sessions every 2 weeks. And not everybody goes 2 weeks. But it's rare to find a church offering their ceremonies every week. And in part because they might have realized with their own experience that it didn't really work. In the second session, the effects were not really there, and it was best to give more time before having another experience with the substance.
Yeah, super interesting. So there is clearly some relationship, like
yeah.
The effects can diminish on this particular one. So the purpose of this session is to anticipate. You gave us a lot of insights about what we can expect. So as individuals, we can expect new treatments, we can expect new ways to deal with mental health. You mentioned the market opportunity, the social opportunity of kind of making this a topic. There's going to be new businesses, there might be new opportunities to kind of re-engage with old knowledge. And the last question I want to ask you kind of ties back to anticipating what we can expect from the policy framework. Do you think we're going to continue seeing this like newfound re-acceptance of these substances into society? And the question is, what is the largest barrier to adoption by national health services with these substances?
Yeah, that's a hard question because national health services vary very widely. They are very different, right? The U.S., for example, doesn't have a public healthcare system. Brazil, on the other hand, has one of the largest public healthcare systems in the planet. So these are two very different healthcare marketplaces, and the barriers for acceptance in each will probably differ as well. But one major obstacle still is the placement of these substances under the Schedule 1 category of the controlled substances in the US, or I think it's Schedule A in the UK. And there have been calls in the past years from researchers from many institutions for the rescheduling of these compounds, right? They might be put in Schedule 2, for example, and that would already make a huge difference for research and for the biotech companies to be able to move faster and more efficiently in developing these new treatments.
Thank you very much. There are more questions coming. Unfortunately, we don't have time, so I suggest you just like engage with the audience at the end of the session. Thank you very much. Please give a warm round of applause to Eduardo Schenberg.